Something we've seen this generation is a slant towards action in games that aren't naturally action-oriented. From the RPG to the stealther, the byword this generation has been action, pretty much no matter the genre. And I think the propensity for action this generation can be traced directly back to Resident Evil 4, a game that abandoned the series' survival horror lineage in favour of action horror. Not only did this show the industry just how you can turn basically any genre into an over-the-shoulder shooter, it proved to be an enormous critical and commercial success, indicating that if publishers wanted to make money, they should turn basically any genre into an over-the-shoulder shooter. So it comes as no surprise that Resident Evil 5 is pretty much identical to Resident Evil 4, save a few small changes. In fact, it's really kind of a remake. Do you remember how Resident Evil 2 added loads of awesome new things like the B scenario and the Nemesis? I know he's not called the Nemesis, but I call him the Nemesis anyway. And the fourth survivor and the tofu guy and all that stuff. It took Resident Evil 1 and really expanded on it. Remember how awesome that was? Well, Resident Evil 5 doesn't do anything like that. It really is just a remake. And while that's not necessarily a bad thing in general, in this specific instance it backfires. Resident Evil 4 is a good game, to be sure, but between Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 5, we had Dead Space. Dead Space is pretty much just Resident Evil 4 in space, but the game also improved significantly on Resident Evil 4 in every single way, except the bosses, while Resident Evil 5 slavishly reproduces all the crap in Resident Evil 4 as well as the good stuff. And that means the single biggest problem with Resident Evil 5, at least if you're playing co-op, is the controls. You still can't move while aiming, which was stupid back in the tank control days, and it's just as... Oh, that's right, Resident Evil 5 still uses tank controls. Granted, you can now steer with your mouse, but the character movement is extremely sluggish. It's so crappy that the spin 180 degrees command that PC gamers just love to make fun of, with good reason, is actually useful in the PC version. In Dead Space, camera movement and character movement are independent of each other, which is exactly how it should be. In Resident Evil 5, character turning is tied to the camera, while strafing is only possible while standing still. Resident Evil 5 should have controlled like Dead Space, or should have just been a first-person shooter. It's that simple. If you're not sure why this is a problem, it's simply because you'll spend half your time wrestling with the uncooperative, awkward controls, which artificially inflates the difficulty and just generally makes it frustrating as fuck. I enjoy challenging games, but when it is the mechanism through which you interact with the game that is challenging rather than the game itself, that's a problem. I mean, look at this. Your character must overdose on caffeine between loading screens because I can hold my hand much steadier than that, and I have frail, weak nerd arms. And just so we're clear on what I mean by this, I mean it ruins the fucking game. Pad users, bless their adorable little hearts, probably don't know any better, but for anyone used to playing with a good input device, this shit is fucking horrible. But as I said, the controls are only the worst part of the game if you're playing co-op. If you're playing single player, you have an even more serious problem. Whether you're playing single player or co-op, you're always going to have a companion with you. The entire game is designed and balanced for two characters, making the second character's performance very important. And that will be fine, but the companion AI is, well, special. It's extremely bad at knocking enemies off you when they attack, something that will happen semi-regularly, and it's utterly incapable of inventory management, which is especially annoying, as Resident Evil 5 has a terrible inventory. Resident Evil 4 actually had a pretty cool inventory. How many slots an item used was based on the size of the item. So if you drop that rocket launcher, you have room for like 8 boxes of ammo in the space it was using. Resident Evil 5 uses a one item, one slot system. So for instance, a box of pistol bullets uses as much space as a shotgun, and you only get 9 slots. So you'll be spending quite a lot of your time juggling items around, which is bad enough in and of itself, but when you're playing single player, you'll have to pick up everything and pass it over to the retarded AI. It's just atrocious. The AI is good at one thing though. It's good at running head fucking first into enemies rather than hanging back and shooting them. It really is ridiculous for a game built around two characters to have and to rely on such terrible AI. And this AI and these controls really ruin what would otherwise be a fairly strong third-person shooter, as the game does have pretty much all the good stuff from Resident Evil 4. The story, if it can really be called that, is still just as stupid and dismissible as in previous Resident Evil games, but 5 does actually have pretty solid voice acting and writing overall.
Oh shit.
So you must be Irving.
Wow, perceptive, aren't ya?
You think...
Except for this guy. You play as Chris from the original Resident Evil in search of Jill or something, but I don't really think anyone is going to care at any point why Chris is doing what he's doing. You're accompanied by, or if you're co-oping, possibly playing as Shiva, an African woman, so naturally her voice actor is American, and her impression of an African comes off as sounding English more than anything else, which I find very annoying. You walk around a bit, and then there are zombies, just like Resident Evil 4. Of course, they're not actual zombies, as they're not actually dead, but that doesn't stop them from taking 6 bullets before dying. They can also run and use weapons, but I'm just going to call them zombies anyway. The combat is of course at the heart of Resident Evil 5, and friendly AI and controls notwithstanding, it's really quite good. The enemies come thick and fast, usually from multiple directions, and frequently have a mixture of ranged and melee fighters, forcing you to take cover, retreat, or at least prioritise your attacks, trying to put the ranged guys down before the melee guys get near you, which can be pretty tense. As with Resident Evil 4, you can aim for the legs to knock guys to their knees, hands to get them to drop their weapons, or heads for maximum damage. This is further mixed up by some enemies carrying shields or wearing these weird masks that protect their heads. As with Resident Evil 4, Resident Evil 5 is firmly an action game, but it often may not feel like it. The way items appear in crates and drop from enemies is designed to give you slightly more than you need to complete a given area, which gives the impression that you're barely making it through and that ammo conservation is important. The reality is that the game will keep giving you what you need, but only what you need if you keep killing stuff. It pretends to be a survival horror game, but it really is an action horror game through and through. It's the kind of thing that constantly keeps you on the edge of your seat, until you recognise that the game is designed that way. Then it's just nothing. You can still upgrade weapons and buy and sell stuff, just like in Resident Evil 4, but the "what are you buying" guy has gone, and now it's done through a menu at the end of each level. The "what are you buying" guy was pretty stupid, but it was at least some kind of explanation. The buying and selling to apparently no one in Resident Evil 5 just feels super contrived. The combat is mostly broken up by periods of quiet and item collection, rather than exploration or puzzles. You can communicate with your partner using simple dog commands, and there is voice chat support, but there's no text typing support, which is a big shame. One very cool thing about the dog commands is that if you stray too far from your partner, you'll hear them through your radio, which is a really nice little touch. There isn't very much in the way of teamwork required, though, besides the game's difficulty being tailored for 2 people. You can knock enemies off your partner, and most doors in the game seem to require 2 people to open them, and now and then you'll be separated from each other and one character will be expected to cover the other, but that's really it. Probably the worst part of the whole 2 players thing is the quick time events. We all hate quick time, right? Except for that one guy, and you know who you are. Well, try doing a QTE with a second player, doubling the chance of failure. It's really, really fucking tedious. Another annoyance is that Chris is right-handed and Shiva is left-handed. Lefties get pretty short-changed in games, and it is at least cool to see them get to play a left-handed character for once. But all they've done is swapped one form of discrimination for another. There should be an option for each character to choose their handedness, and the lack thereof left me annoyed for most of the game. Though to be fair, the other crap in Resident Evil 5 had already pushed me way past annoyed. Now, I couldn't really review Resident Evil 5 without talking about the controversy the game has stirred up. You know what it is, I know what it is, it's the R word, so I'm just going to say it. Realism. The realism Capcom originally planned for Resident Evil 5 was particularly controversial. Many people were very offended by the realistic depiction of Africa as being inhabited mostly by black people. Realism! They cried. Black people in Africa! We cannot allow this! Realism! Capcom has always been a ballsy company in that respect. Resident Evils 1, 2 and 3, set in America, had mostly white people in them, with a few other ethnicities peppered in here and there. It was very realistic, and I had nothing but extreme praise for their ballsiness to put white people in a game set in America. It really was a turning point for racial issues in computer games. And then, in another bold move by Capcom, Resident Evil 4 was set in Spain, and all of the zombies were almost entirely olive-skinned Spanish people. It was a bold, realistic move. And now Resident Evil 5, set in Africa, originally had black enemies, as one would expect. But this realism caused a public outcry. Realism is just a part of the world we live in, and we have to learn to accept that people would respond. But these whiny bitches just kept complaining and wouldn't accept it, and the craze of realism continued. Eventually, Capcom decided to mix in a crapload of other ethnicities and make the more tribalistic enemies grey-skinned. So thanks to those whiny bitches and Capcom for being spineless, we have a very unrealistic game in Resident Evil 5 for the first time in the series. Resident Evil 5 is a disaster. Multiplayer is plagued by terrible controls and a host of niggling little annoying issues, while singleplayer is pretty much unplayable thanks to all the problems multiplayer has, plus an absolutely broken companion AI. Anyone with an urge to play Resident Evil 5 should just play Resident Evil 4, or better yet, Dead Space.